And I want to thank everybody for joining us. Welcome to our third webinar in our Inspiring Student Research webinar series. We are so excited to be joined again by Dr. Capozzola from MIT, and we're going to be talking about eavesdropping, kind of continuing with our Why Historians Are the Rudest People. However, before I turn things over to Dr. Capozzola, I just want to review a couple quick things. This is Module 3. We are wrapping it this week. Module 4 is going to launch on Friday. At the end of the module, at the end of the course, your final assessment is due. And we've had it live for a month. I'm hoping you've checked it out online. If not, go ahead and check it out. Couple things to know. The deadline is Monday, December 14th. You've got a month to do it. It is doable, I promise. But I also need to say that you have to do it because it's 40% of your final grade. So if you don't do it and you take a 0 on the thing, the chances of passing the class are pretty much non-existent. So what you want to do is go into that Module 5, which is your final assessment. We've got 3 things in there to help you. The first is the template file. Download that, save that. That's what you're going to type directly into. Don't waste time putting a whole formatting thing together. We've done that for you. The second piece is the instructions. We tell you exactly what we're looking for, and we also give you a copy of the rubric with some hints to help you do as well as you can in each of the categories. We also have the location where you upload it. And I promise, if you get stuck on the upload, I want you to send it to your facilitator or send it to me. If it's timestamped by midnight, December 14th, we'll take it. Now, one thing to keep in mind, this is a hard deadline, and I've got to stick to a hard deadline. Because many of you are getting credit from the University of San Diego, we have a time window in which we must input grades. We're also at the end of their semester as they're getting ready to leave, and I know some of you are looking for that salary advancement. So we want to get those grades processed and the transcript back to you as quickly as humanly possible. Now, what are we looking for in the assessment? This is one of those tasks where I have a lot when I talk to people, I say, don't overthink this. What are we looking for? We're looking for content you learned in the course. That can come from anything you want. Maybe it's one of the articles you read. Maybe it's one of the primary sources that you found. Maybe it's something in one of Dr. Capozzola's lectures. Maybe it's something that Ashley or I did with a strategy. You're going to tell us, what'd you learn? And don't go overboard. Hey, in this article, I was really intrigued by this idea. Or in the third webinar, when you talked about this, this, and this, that really drove my thinking and I wanted my students to know it. So take a piece of content and one piece of content. Don't try to put 18 pieces together. It's not going to work. Second piece, at least one primary source from the Library of Congress. This is another one. Don't go overboard. It is far better to use 1 or 2 sources really well and really effectively than to create an activity where you're shoving 25 different Library of Congress primary sources at your students. You're just going to overwhelm them, right? Pick something that's really cool and really interesting. And then the third piece is an active learning strategy. What are your students going to do? Are your students going to be reading, writing, debating, discussing? What we want to hear is active verbs, right? What they're doing, it's not about having something that's right or wrong. It is about having something that's age appropriate, right? What I would do in a 6th grade classroom is very different than what I do in an 11th or 12th grade classroom. And it should be adapted to meet the needs of your learners where you are right now in the scenario you are teaching right now. So if that means creating a virtually accessible lesson versus a hybrid lesson versus a live lesson, full flexibility and all that. I don't want, and I know from being a teacher and going to class at night, I know sometimes you just created things to like make people happy and get your grade. I want this to be something that you can drop into your classroom and use. Okay, so think about that. If you haven't gone on and read the instructions, please read them. I promise if you read them and have questions, Whitney or Paul, Whitney if you're in sections 1 or 2, Paul if you're in section 3, would be happy to talk through it with you. I'd be happy to talk with it through you. I will not be happy to talk with it through it with you at 11 o'clock on December 14th. I will be in bed and I won't be able to help you then. But we've got a month and you can totally do this. All right, keep in mind too, read the rubric, go through it. If there's any line on the rubric that is not clear with you, we like to keep this as transparent as possible. We want you to succeed. All right, Just like our other two webinars, we've got the Q&A box. If you have questions on the assessment or content, we've got our Q&A session at the end. We'll answer any and all of them. You've got to do the survey at the end to get your attendance credit. The slides are posted up on Schoology. And if you were here for our little bit of a pre-show, the audio files are also posted up on Schoology. So if you want to listen to any of them again, or maybe use some of this with your students, it's all there. Module 4, which is our last module, will launch on Friday. All right, I'm done my housekeeping. I'm going to stop sharing and turn things over to Dr. Capozzola. Thanks for joining us tonight.
All right, thank you, Lynn and Ashley, and thanks everybody for logging on tonight, especially those of you for whom, maybe there wasn't school today because it was Veterans Day, so I appreciate your taking the time this evening, and also want to acknowledge that it is Veterans Day, say thanks to any veterans who are on the call, and also to people who, friends and family who supported those who have served in the past or are serving right now. We are going to dive right in to this evening, and in the last two sessions, if you remember, I warned you that historians are some of the rudest people because they do things like open dead people's mail and read their letters and their diaries because they're constantly, staring at people, looking at them, trying to figure out, from their visual images, how they're communicating. And of course, the other thing that historians love to do is listen in on other people's conversations. We love to listen to their public speeches and their formal presentations, but we also would love to have heard all of the conversations, the sort of water cooler gossip, the singing in the shower, all the kinds of ways that people express themselves through sound and music over the years that may have been lost to us. But an awful lot of it was recorded and remains to us, and we're going to sort of dive into that tonight. And why, question again, like in other times, why do we do it, right? First, these are ways that people communicated and expressed themselves. Sometimes just to, get something off their chest, sometimes because they wanted to inform or to persuade, to change someone's mind, to change America, right? And so we want to kind of look into that along the way. But also, this kind of communication also has a history. The technologies have changed. The genres and formats have changed, right? Even, the social conventions of how we listen to music, how we make music, how we buy and sell music. All of those have changed. And the political and cultural and ethnic contexts in which music is made have, of course, also changed as America has evolved over the years. And of course, also in world history too. So we want to look not only at how this helps us understand history, but also so we can see the history of music and sound itself, right? So we want students to work with it. And judging from the Q&A, right, and from some of the posts that people posted already, many of you are already doing this in your classroom, right? And you're doing it intently, and you have plenty of ideas for how to do this. Lots of great ideas, and at the beginning, Lynn asked for sort of, fun ideas. She could also have asked for what are some of the challenges that come with using music in the classroom. And I think if that may come up in the Q&A and discussion as well, right? Because it's not always easy. Just as it wasn't easy when we were reading letters from the 18th century, just as it wasn't easy when we were trying to figure out, what's the intention of this political cartoon last month, so too, it can be difficult to work with music in the classroom, in part because it's unfamiliar. And I think three things in particular, right, have come up, partly in my experience, then also in some of the postings that you've done. It can be hard to interpret the motive and the audience, right? Why did somebody write this song, right? Who are they writing it to? What would it have been like to listen to it? Second, it can also be hard to listen to music that's not like the music we listen to, right? To sort of interpret a musical culture or a consumer culture that's very different from ours, or even kind of a musical tradition. Particularly if we're doing world history or world cultures, right, where the music may be very unfamiliar, either to the students or even to us as instructors, right? And then third, and for me, I think this is the hardest thing with teaching about music in the classroom, is that all of us as consumers of music in the 21st century are primed to add that the very first question we ask ourselves about a song is, do I like it, right? And when you are doing that in the classroom, that's not always a useful question, right? That in fact, what we need to do is change that to a kind of a historical question, an analytical question. And the way I like to frame it is, I tell students, you know, that with films, with music, with anything like that, I say, I don't actually care whether you like it, right? I want to change the question to, what is this song telling us, right? 20 years, 50 years, 150 years after it was written or performed, right? What might this song tell us across time? How can we use it to understand the people who made it, people who listened to it, and how does its messages and its speak to us still today? So what we're going to do in the two parts tonight is look at some ways to deal with the sources. And there's no shortage of material we could have used, but we decided that we wanted to focus in a really tight focus on the history of music during the Great Depression in the 1930s in the United States. And in part because this is an important turning point in the history of music and mass media, but also because it's a really rich collection of materials in the Library of Congress. And from everything from sheet music, where you can actually look at the printed notes and play them if you are a musical person, or just look at the covers like you would look at an album cover. There's sheet music, right? There's recorded sound, there's oral histories and testimonies. And of course, there's also a big feature on the Library of Congress website called the National Jukebox, a way to basically look up a song that might be in kind of the public domain and listen to it freely and accessibly through the National Jukebox portal. Now, like I said, this only scratches the surface of America's musical history. And of course, that history is more complex than we're going to cover tonight, or than the readings covered. And it is also more diverse. And I just want to acknowledge that many of you flagged this in the discussion boards, that some of the particular readings and listenings focus largely on white artists and performers of the 1930s, many of them in dialogue with other musical traditions, particularly African-American musical traditions. And we're going to look at that over the course of the evening tonight, and see how multiple traditions are operating in 1930s music, and also how you can kind of bring those into the classroom, right? These sort of multiple voices in the classroom, and get students to examine that. All right, so now what I'm going to do is dive in and share my screen and show some slides. All right, so why historians are the rudest people, right? Because we are always listening to what everyone else has to do and say. As we do this, I want you to bear in mind some guiding questions, right? 3 in particular. First, how have people used music and sound to express themselves, right? Basically, what are all of the ways that people have expressed themselves? Second, we'll look at how has musical communication, if you think about it broadly speaking, that's one kind of oral communication. There are speeches, there are testimonies, there's collective worship, there's all kinds, there's shouting and protesting. But if we focus just on musical communication, how has that been used to inform or persuade? And then the third is, how could I inspire students to find and use resources like this, right? These guiding questions, if you're now that you're in the 3rd webinar, you kind of know that they're going to structure everything that we're doing here over the course of the fall. So you can guess where we're going in the future, right? And what I want to do then, right, is focus on the first question, right? How have people used music and sound to express themselves, right? And I want to get at this by returning to that question. What is this song telling us? And people sing for any number of reasons, right? Sometimes they want to document the world around them. This is what I see. This is what I feel, right? But most of the time, our songs are indirect. Sometimes they're just expressing an emotion, right? Where, of course, a love song is full of love, right? But that's just one common form. Sometimes people are more interested in the sound and the rhythm. And people often sing, particularly in pre-industrial times, would sing to keep rhythm at work or in the fields of a farm, right? or they might sing in a nursery, right, to create a rhythm and to get a child to sleep, right? And sometimes people sing not to document the world that they live in, but to imagine a different one. Maybe it's a lost world that they're missing, or a future world that they're imagining, right? So as we go through, as we ask students, what is this song telling us? Why, what might they be imagining, right? It's not so much that they necessarily are documenting the world around them, right? But of course, sometimes they are, right? And in fact, we can see this in one of the songs that you listened to for for this week's seminar. A very famous, in fact, one of the most well remembered songs of the 1930s, "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" Right? This was written in 1932 in the depths of the Great Depression. And if you listen to it or read the lyrics that go along with it, the lyrics clearly document a sense of loss and falling, right? We used to have it good and now we don't. I used to be, a brave soldier, and now I'm in a breadline. And that sense of loss and defeat is really palpable, while also documenting the world as it was around the singer in 1932, right? And that was the Great Depression, right? And just 90 seconds on context for those of you who may not know the details as well as others, right? That first and foremost, right, the most important phenomenon of the Depression was unemployment, right, as you see here, right, that generates sort of shortages of money and food that lead to the breadline that you're seeing here from Chicago in 1931. Right, unemployment at the national level in 1932 was 25%. And probably much higher because many workers would never have been counted in unemployment in its statistics, particularly women workers and agricultural workers. And in some cities, it was particularly badly concentrated, right? One industry cities would have often been hit really hard by unemployment. In Cleveland, the unemployment rate was 50%. In Toledo, Ohio, it was 80%. Essentially, almost the entire city is out of work. And it was not just an urban phenomenon, it was also rural. Nearly 1/3 of all farmers had or were in danger of losing their land by 1932, mostly due to sort of speculation and debt that had given them too much debt to pay off, and also declining crop prices because people can't really afford food, so they're buying less of it and the prices of it go down, right? And we can hear all that in "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" If that was the only song you heard from the Great Depression, you would recognize that in its lyrics, even in its tone of the music itself, right? But compare that with another song, which was not on your listening from ahead of time, but which people may know, right? "Happy Days Are Here Again." This was a song actually recorded in 1929, but only popularized in 1932. And it became sort of the theme song for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidential campaign that year. The image you see here is of him and President Herbert Hoover on the day of the inauguration in March of 1933. And I think that "Happy Days Are Here Again" conveys, if you listen to it, both the lyrics and the sound, ruthless optimism, enthusiasm, happiness, positivity, right? And this was the sort of most fundamental sort of element of 1930s popular culture. That if you think about all of an overall picture of the popular music of the 1930s, it sounds more like this. Songs like "Life Is Just a Bowl of Cherries," right? "The Sunny Side of the Street," "California, Here I Come," right? The sort of popular, upbeat, fast-paced music. We can see it in other forms of popular culture. Broadway musicals of the period. Comic books were booming, right? In full color inserts for comic strips in the newspaper, comic books as individual purchases with Superman and Wonder Woman, movies, especially those of Walt Disney, booms onto the scene in the 1930s. But increasingly by the end of the decade, color film, right? At a time when people attended the movies about 5 times a week. Going to the movies was about as popular, almost as popular as watching television, right, is for us today. When people listen to the radio, to these upbeat songs, maybe 5 hours a day. People were used so many jukeboxes, right, where you put the money in to hear a song. Jukeboxes were so popular that by the mid-1930s, the US Mint had to start issuing more nickels, right, just to make sure that there were enough nickels to go around to keep the jukeboxes going. Right? So if you only looked at American popular culture of the 1930s, you would see music and images and words that were loud, lively, raucous, and colorful, and upbeat and positive. So I want to take a second here and just pause, and I'm going to ask you to take a very quick poll. Hopefully, there you go. As you can see, it asks you a kind of a question. Was the Great Depression depressing? Right? Yes or no?
We're voting quickly here. All right, we've got a 85%. Go ahead, last couple votes. Let's push it in. It looks like our audience says 90% yes, 10% no. Interesting.
All right. So pretty clear sense, right? That in some ways what you're doing is proving that you can't judge a time period just by its popular culture, right? Because if all you knew about the Great Depression were the songs and the movies and the comic books, you would think this was the happiest time in American history, right? But you all are too smart, and you know that the breadlines were real, the unemployment was real, and the devastation was real, and so there must be something else going on in the music, right? So I often use that exercise, right? Was the Great Depression depressing? To get at sort of what it must have been like for people to live through it at the time period. All right, so let me dive back into the slides here and move on to talk for a minute about what did the Great Depression sound like, right? And I want to focus here in particular and draw on some of what you can see, some of what was in the readings, and then supplement it with some more. And I want to focus here in particular on the so-called Dust Bowl, right? What you're seeing here is an image of the plains in Kansas in March 1936. Beginning right before the Depression, in 1930, the Great Plains area from Texas all the way to the Dakotas started experiencing one of the worst droughts in history, turning this incredibly fertile land into near desert. And when this happened, which was then exacerbated by the financial crisis of the Depression, hundreds of thousands of families left the region, moving largely to the west in search of better land, and then ultimately really just work, shelter, and food. And many of them ended up in low-wage agricultural and migrant labor in the 1930s. Now, part of what we can see in these images, right, is the people themselves, right, in images like this, taken not from Kansas, but from California, showing, and if you can't read the caption at the bottom, it says, "More Oklahomans reach California via the cotton fields of Arizona." Right? And so, migrations in search of work were common. And these figures, who describe themselves in many ways as refugees, were sort of symbols of the Depression. And you can see them in many forms of culture in the 1930s. It shows up in the fiction of John Steinbeck, in the folk music of Woody Guthrie, right? One of the readings that you did for this week, and some of the listening that you could do as well. The other thing I wanted to give you to read for this week were some of the music and testimonies of the migrants themselves, right? And we had two of them, right? First was the song "Sunny California" by Mary Sullivan, right? And if you listen to that one, or if you didn't, you can go back onto Schoology and listen to it later. You'll notice it has a title that sounds very positive, "Sunny California," but by the time you get to the end of the song, you realize that the singer misses home, right? That no matter how sunny it is in California, her life has not turned out for the better, right? She misses her old way of life. She misses home, right? And similarly, I wanted to give you that recording by Flora Robertson Shafter, where she was sort of writing up, this is a simple poem that she had written, "Why We Came to California," right? That was recorded in 1941. And this, I wanted to give it to you in her own voice, right? Because that's a sound from the time period that has come down to us 80 years later, right? It's a primary source, right? It's an original document, right? It's an oral one, right? It's sound, right? But we can hear her voice talking to us. And the fact that her voice is hard to hear and her accent is, depending on where you are in America, might be a little hard to understand, right? I think that's part of what we get to share with students, right? Because someone took the time to record these voices and record these people. And of course, also to document them in images, especially in this, perhaps the most famous image from the Great Depression, the photograph Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange. And so hopefully, as you're looking at these images, as you're listening to the music, reading about them, maybe you pause to ask, well, where did all these come from, right? Why are there so many? And why are so many of them at the Library of Congress, right? And I think this is important because it gets at this question, right, of the New Deal arts programs, right? These were a series of programs established during the Great Depression as part of the New Deal. Numerically, they're not huge. It's not they employ hundreds, sometimes thousands of artists. And they aim to do two things. First, to keep people in the arts professions employed, right? And to keep them sort of off the relief rolls and out of those breadlines, right? So they were basically keeping painters and artists and actors and musicians and others in business during the Great Depression. But also second, to document, particularly in programs like this, to document the social conditions of the 1930s and inform the American public about the world around them. Because if you were doing okay during the Great Depression, and if you were spending all your time just reading comic books and going to the movies, you didn't understand the world that people like the Migrant Mother lived in, right? And so these photographs, these images and stories were crucial, right? So that's one part of it. And this leads a whole series of people to go out and record these stories. Photographers like Dorothea Lange did this by recording images. Oral historians went and collected testimonies, right? And a group of people known as folklorists, right? People who are interested in folk culture and traditional ways of life, recorded both oral histories, songs, and other practices all across the United States, right? But focusing particular on cultures that by the 1930s were seen as maybe fading or disappearing from the mainstream mass culture that everyone was seeing in radio and comic books and movies coming out of Hollywood and New York. They looked for ethnic minorities, for recent immigrants, for Native Americans, right? For African Americans. They were sort of tracing and documenting cultural traditions in the United States as part of the New Deal arts program. And one of the most important of these people was a folklorist by the name of Alan Lomax. Right? And Alan Lomax recorded music, in particular, as he traveled through the Mississippi Delta. Right? And this is a photograph that he took at a prison in Angola, a state administered prison, where he interviewed prisoners, recorded songs by African-American prisoners, and documented them in ways that then generated recordings that later musicians were inspired by, right? And perhaps the most important person that Alan Lomax met in Angola, Mississippi in the 1930s was a singer named Leadbelly, who was drawing on blues traditions from the Delta, from New Orleans, from other African-American traditions of the Deep South. Lomax records them. Those get recorded and circulated through the Library of Congress and the New Deal arts programs in ways that inspire other artists a generation later and are still available to us today. At the same time, other people, and other times, Lomax is traveling all around the country. And here we see a group, you see him, basically a photo he took when he was recording a group of schoolgirls in San Antonio, Texas, singing what's known as a corrido, right? Basically a Mexican song that they would have known from sort of childhood, but that would have been sort of, many of them were retooled in the Great Depression to reflect the work conditions and the experiences of Tejano and Chicanos in the US-Mexico border region during the Great Depression period. Right? And in fact, that history, right, is in part available to us through photographs and documents but also through multiple musical traditions. Now, at the same time, like I said, part of the reason Lomax and others are running around recording this music with a sense of urgency is a sense that these traditions were undergoing rapid change by the 1930s, right? Whether they're recording Tejano songs in South Texas, whether they're recording African-American songs in, say, the sort of coastal regions of South Carolina or Georgia, whether they're recording so-called old time or country songs in the mountains of Appalachia, there was a sense that this was necessary work to counter the powerful force of popular culture that was emerging at the time period. Media industries that were sort of standardizing and homogenizing, right? And in particular, as many Americans turned in this time period from being producers of music, people who played the banjo, right? People who sang songs, shifted from being producers of music to being consumers of music, right? Who bought music and played it, right? And we can see that eventually all of this is going to come together in a crucial moment, not during the 1930s, but a decade later, during the Second World War. Because in that 10-year period between 1940 and 1950, nearly 40% of Americans moved from one part of the United States to another. And when they moved, whether for military service, for new jobs, for just better living conditions, right? And in the 1940s, they took their musical traditions with them and they remade them, often blended them with those of other cultures. These could often get mixed up together, right? In places where sort of poor white Americans and poor Black Americans would move to Detroit for war work. They would move to California, right? Different ethnic and musical traditions might merge, sometimes in sort of respectful borrowing, sometimes through basically imitation or plagiarism, right? Where sometimes sort of musical companies and recording artists would sort of commercialize folk traditions that other artists might have just seen as sort of the common property of Americans. This process will eventually, of course, give us rock and roll, right? If you think about it as a 1950s musical phenomenon, it's in some ways drawing all of these traditions together in ways that can only be explained by the history of the music industry and also the history of Americans moving around the country with their musical traditions during the Depression and World War II, right? So that's a whole lot of things about sort of the ways in which musical communication changes over time. Let's switch now to another question. How has musical communication been used to inform or persuade, right? Now, of course, just because people just because people shifted in some ways from being producers of music to consumers of music, doesn't mean that they weren't still producing music. There are still tons of artists, still tons of musicians, and still tons of people who use music to inform or persuade people of other things. And I want to focus on the power of song to inform or persuade by looking at two musical moments from the 1930s that I want to share with you. The first is a song called Strange Fruit, which was written in 1937 written and then recorded by two white supporters of the civil rights movements of the 1930s, right? And which focused in many ways on opposition to violence against African Americans. And in particular were inspired by a lynching that had occurred in Indiana in 1930. And wrote the lyrics and then the music in response to this. The lyrics indirectly address racial violence off through a kind of a technique of sort of irony, right? It was sort of like, it's not sort of directly there and quite the same way that Brother, Can You Spare a Dime is. But between the lyrics and again, the sound, right? It's a very sort of sad, plaintive kind of sound in the song. It's impossible to miss. The song was first performed in 1937, but really recorded in a big way in 1939 by the woman you see here, Billie Holiday. And it was performed largely in multiracial settings, right? In very deliberate attempts to create alliances and support for the political content of this song. It was also, for almost every radio station in America, too controversial, too provocative, right? And in fact, most Americans didn't encounter this in the mass popular culture of the day. They encountered it secondhand, as an underground recording, as a sense that they were participating in something, right? So it's worth, sort of thinking about that. It was ways in which who was hearing the song then, but also who might have heard it later, or a generation later, indeed. And like I said, it is a song that is difficult to listen to. I also will say right here, I think it's difficult to teach. And you would need to make some very careful choices about your students and whether they are sufficiently informed about history, whether they have the cultural competency to sort of deal with some pretty difficult material in a song like that. But the song's history shows that a protest song can sort of have an impact. People can get motivated specifically by a protest song. Sometimes merely the fact of singing is itself a form of protest. Not what you sing, but the fact that you are singing. And here I would look at another musical performance from the 1930s. Here you see Marian Anderson, right, who was at the time an extremely well-known largely classical or operatic singer from the 1930s. She was scheduled to sing at a concert in Washington, D.C. at the Daughters of the American Revolution's Constitution Hall, but the concert was canceled in part because the host institution refused to permit her to sing to an integrated audience. The concert hall was segregated, and also because the District of Columbia itself, right, had laws of segregation forbidding integration in musical performances. So rather than canceling the concert entirely, Anderson, through her work with the NAACP and intervention by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, performed in a public concert, which therefore was not subject to the District of Columbia's laws on segregation, on the morning of Easter Sunday, April 9th, 1939. And you see that here. Now, what's interesting is, again, we can hear some of the songs that Marian Anderson sang. Then 80 years ago, they sort of come down to us over the years. We can also sort of pay a minute or two of attention to her playlist, basically thinking about what was she singing. And she was singing some sort of traditional classical songs that were part of her professional repertoire. She was singing religious melodies, a hymn like Ave Maria, and she was singing spirituals from Black religious traditions. Many people mistakenly think that Marian Anderson sang the national anthem at the Lincoln Memorial on April 9th, 1939. But in fact, that she didn't do until 1963, when she returned to the Lincoln Memorial for the March on Washington, and in fact sang again 24 years later. And so we can see in this ways in which protest songs like Strange Fruit and song as protests like Marian Anderson at the Lincoln Memorial could be important sort of turning points in generating what would become the civil rights movement, which is the subject of the fourth webinar that we'll be looking at next month. So just to wrap up, third thing, just in conclusion before I turn it over to Lynn, is this question: how could I inspire my students to find and use resources like this, right? And I'll just bring this all back together, which is to just encourage them to ask, what is this song telling us? What can it tell us X number of years later, right? And sometimes we need to go find a song, but also I hope we realized, and your polling results show, that we can't necessarily trust the song. You can't judge a song by its title, and you can't judge it by its lyrics. You have to kind of put it in its historical context. What might it have meant to people at the time? Why might people in the middle of the Great Depression have been really interested in popular, happy, upbeat songs, right? It might not be because they were happy, right? It might be because happiness is something they wanted to imagine, right? What might a protest song do, right? And how might people use song to protest, even if the songs themselves may be, in fact, actually ones that we might not immediately recognize as political. Um, and then just encourage them in some ways to start with their own songs, right? Their own playlists, right? What might historians a generation from now know or think about you based on the songs that you have on your phone, in your house, on your computer, on your Spotify playlist, or what have you, right? And that kind of, investigating and putting yourself into history can be another great way of exploring this. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Lynne. So thank you.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I love about kind of tackling this idea of music is different ways that it connects with students, because I think students do connect with music, and I think that that bridge that Christopher was just saying is so important. Ask students simple questions to get them started. What songs do you listen to when you're happy? How about when you're mad? What if you want to get inspired? Because I think we all have that innate sense. And I'm also going to throw this out. You don't have to be terribly musically inclined yourself to give this a try. So what I thought we'd do is start tonight with 5 strategies for analyzing sound recordings. Well, okay, if you want to analyze them, the first thing you've got to do, obviously, is you've got to find them. Okay, so let's talk about 2 different strategies to find music or sound recordings using the Library of Congress. So, on the main landing page, you've got the drop down, right? That search bar, and you can limit it to annotated or sheet music and also audio recordings. That's one method, but I'm going to show you a different way, and this is a way I think might be very useful to some of our NHD researchers, and the way that I actually found the audio recordings I used at the beginning of the program. On the main LOC landing page, I went directly into their digital collections. So these are things that the librarians and the archivists there and the archival specialists have said, hey, here's a topic, here's a group of materials. One of the things that I do, when you click on that, there are 440, and I'm sure it's and counting. I'm sure it's going to be growing. But as of yesterday, there were 440 collections on there. Now, I don't necessarily have time to get through all 440, especially if I'm looking for audio recordings. And this is where the filtering on the left-hand side really comes into play. If I click audio recordings, it's going to narrow me down to 58 collections, which all include audio recordings. So that's a much more manageable number. And what I did is I looked through there and I said, okay, what are 5 ones that I think my students in the classroom would be really interested in? And part of it was the time period we were looking at. So I pulled from the African American Band and Music recording collections, from Ragtime, from the after the Day of Infamy, the Man on the Street interviews. And this is a really fascinating collection to me, because these are people who went out the day after and, several months after and just talked to ordinary citizens. What was life like? That's where you find out that, Mrs. Nelson was a little annoyed that the price of butter was going up in her town. I also pulled from the Blues and Gospel collection. There's also an audio recording, a documentary project connected to September 11th, 2001. Now, again, this is just 5 of the almost 60 that include audio recordings. And keep in mind, a collection includes audio recordings and other things. So that's an interesting way to get students started, and that's how I pulled the ones that we used at the beginning. The second thing I want to encourage you to do, start playing music or sound informally. Just start popping things on. Maybe it's a song about a time period, maybe it's a song before a time period. Use this at any kind of downtime you have. The beginning of class, taking attendance, end of class, work time. Just start putting it on in the background. In the beginning, I wouldn't ask a whole lot of questions about it. I might just play it one day. If you're live, play it while classes are switching. Crank the volume up a little bit. Or maybe play it while students are thinking, depending on the type of music, but just starting to get it into your classroom by just getting students to listen to it. Now, we don't just want them to listen and appreciate, that's nice, but we also know that these are amazing primary sources from the time. And just like any primary source, they have to be investigated. So if we're going to analyze a piece, I'm going to encourage you to have your students listen to it at least twice. This is why I think choosing clips that are short, a minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes, are the best way to get started. First time I would just have them listen. And then on the second go around, I would give them tasks to listen for, right? So I might ask one group to pay attention to the lyrics. I might ask one group to pay attention to the banjo music. I might ask one group to pay attention to rhythm. And I think this is a great opportunity to engage our musical students. I'm going to be honest, I wasn't one of these musical students, right? I can't read music, I can't play an instrument. But I knew when I got to this point in class, I had students who could. And I had students who could do this and, sing or play an instrument really well. So I would use those students. If you know you have the marching band drum major in your class, ask the marching band drum major to comment on the musical march. What do they know about it? What do they hear? How does a drummer hear something different than a guitar player, right? Bring in those knowledge. Not every student's going to have it, but it brings out often some expertise from students that really adds to the discussion. I think too, when you get to the point of analyzing, you've got to break it up. A lot of students do dive into that, well, I like it or I don't like it or this is dumb, but we don't really care, right? And I'm pulling this again from these Library of Congress organizers that we used in our discussion this time. Start with that observe. What do you hear? What catches your attention? How does it sound? And if you're not sure, use these as starter questions, right? See what students observe on their own and then use these to prompt things maybe students didn't hear. In the reflection, this is where it really gets interesting. And this is where I think it's great to layer a piece of music with a different kind of primary source. So maybe you have an account of the Dust Bowl layered with a song about the Dust Bowl, right? An account about civil rights layered with a song about civil rights. Helping students make those connections and say, well, if we're seeing this happening and then we're hearing this song, how does this gel, right? Does this go together? Is this in opposition or juxtaposition to each other? Feel free to ask a lot of different questions and then ask students what questions they have. Because oftentimes students will think of things very, very differently than the way you'll think of it. And that's great. We want to encourage. And then what I would encourage you to do is after you have the discussion, listen to it again. Ask students, what do they notice now that they didn't notice before? Wherever your students start, they're going to grow. And that's really what we want, right? This growth mindset. Start with where you are. I'm going to give you things to build you up. Now, again, like any strategy in the classroom, you can't do this every day. That's not feasible. But you know what? Maybe you use Music Fridays. Hey, we're going to start Fridays with 5 to 10 minutes of music. I can imagine that might get a couple reluctant or slow going in the hallway students to class a little faster if they like it. Maybe encourage students, hey, this is your time period. Your job is to find me the song. Right? If everybody had a week where they had a song that they were going to bring to class, then all of a sudden your students are invested and maybe they help to lead the analysis because they're going to pick things that are different and that's okay. 3 things that I think can really inspire student research and also potentially really help many of your History Day students. We talked earlier about the online collections at the Library of Congress. Those are invaluable, right? It's also Veterans Day, and the Veterans History Project is a tremendous collection from the library where they are assembling stories and accounts and material from U.S. veterans across multiple conflicts. As we get closer in time, many of those are including both audio and or video content. And I often would encourage students, okay, if you want to understand what happened in a particular point in military history, we know that so many people died, right? We don't really have their accounts or their stories, but we do have many of the accounts and the stories for those who were in that division or in that regiment who were there, who did come home. And those can be some tremendous resources. So I would encourage you to check that out. Finally, this is really bridging into our Module 4. The Civil Rights History Project is another piece, particularly that has good audio-visual content. Keep in mind, our students are going to be using this in different ways, right? So paper writers, they probably use music the least. But I've seen some really cool papers where they analyze a piece of music or use a piece of music maybe at the beginning as a hook or to carry through a paper. Website students, they have that media ability. They also have the ability to really analyze and use some cool visual sources that they can mix with the music. I have seen performance students do all kinds of things with music. Now, be careful here. NHD, one of these rules that floats around the internet is that if you sing or you dance, you win. Not necessarily, right? You have to think, can you sing? Can you dance? But, and is it appropriate for your topic, right? I mean, there was a project a couple years ago on the history of tap dancing. Tap dance was used as part of the project. That makes sense. But sometimes throwing in a bit of music that helps tell the story can be really, really interesting. We've got our documentary students, many of whom put musical tracks or use musical interludes as part of their documentaries. So think about this as you're working through with your students. I'm not saying that every project needs to include music, but projects that have musical elements should take advantage of them. And keep in mind, it doesn't just have to be the audio recording. You can use lyrics, you can use covers of sheet music, and oftentimes, even if students aren't using it in there, like think about those the man on the street interviews after December 7th. You don't necessarily have to play the audio file to be able to listen to the audio file and learn from the audio file. So I hope this gives you some suggestions and ideas as you start to work with your students. What we'd like to do is open things up to question and answer. So we are open to questions about the final assessment, about the historical content presented, or about the strategies. Keep in mind, we understand we're approaching the hour and we understand you may need to go. Please, please, please take a minute. I promise, 2 minutes right now. tinyurl.com/nhd-isr21. And keep in mind, the slides and the audio recordings we used tonight are available. We've posted them on Schoology. Just go into Module 3. There's a little subfolder called Webinar 3 Materials. Sorry, I'm not creative when I name anything. It's a purple folder. It's there. You can go in and grab and potentially try it out. If you try it out, use it. Keep in mind, too, this is another option for your final assessment. You don't need to use music, but if you want to try it, here's a cool opportunity to go find something and try it with your students. All right, I've talked a bunch, so let's turn it over to Q&A. Ashley, what do we have in the box that our teachers want to know?
All right, well, first one is from Terry. Terry says, when listening to the oral histories of former slave narratives at the Library of Congress, how do you talk to students about the narratives that might have been different talking to a white person who collected the narrative and what they might share with the descendants? Is it an issue to talk, is this an issue to talk with students about?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And let me just back up and put a little background on that for people who may not know all of this history. So one of the other projects that was part of the New Deal arts programs was the collection by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, of oral histories that were conducted with formerly enslaved people. And these were conducted in the 1930s. So as you can imagine, most of the people who they talked to were really quite old, right? Quite elderly. And they are, in some ways, an incredibly precious resource, right? Of the voices of people who can testify decades after the end of slavery of the legacies that it left for them individually, right? But as Terry's question framed, is that we have to ask some questions about context, right? And most of the interviewers who were doing the question asking were outsiders to the community altogether, right? Not only were they they were almost exclusively white interviewers, they were also almost exclusively from outside the town where they were doing the interviewing, right? Outside the South even, right? And so that, as it does with any kind of interview, any kind of oral history, could shape the extent to which people might have been willing to tell everything, right? What might they have held back? And I think if you have, if you want to kind of get a sort of more advanced students, right, to kind of think about how are documents produced, right? What is audience, point of view, all those kinds of questions, you could definitely do that with these narratives. And in fact, it's pretty important to do that. It may be a little more complicated to do that if your students are just encountering this for the first time, right? If they're in, sort of middle school and you're doing kind of histories of slavery or Civil War, those testimonies in recorded voices can be really personally powerful to younger listeners. But even then, you might want to just sort of acknowledge that these were recorded many decades later, right? And just make sure that students are understanding, that there can be huge gaps in the historical record.
I think another key point to remind students is that many of the people they were interviewing in the 1930s were young children at the end of slavery. And to talk about the idea of childhood memories and how sometimes we see things as a child and we think that they're one way and they can be totally different, or they can be totally right. And that idea of it's a primary source from the time. It's a great primary source, but you have to look at it and analyze it carefully because you have to decide if it is reliable. Just because it's a primary source does not necessarily mean it's a reliable primary source, but it doesn't mean it isn't a primary source or isn't something we might want to consider.
All right. Well, Mark would like to know if there's any evidence to the fact that Brother, Can You Spare a Dime was used during the election of 1932.
I'm pretty sure that it was not. You remember FDR's nickname was the Happy Warrior, right? He was, in some ways, he understood very, very, sort of clearly the impulses that were driving Americans toward toward that upbeat popular culture, right? And he gave them what they were looking for, right? And so I'm pretty sure that a song like that would probably not have been a very good, wouldn't have been thought of as a real vote getter for people at the time. So I think I could be wrong. I can be proved wrong for sure, but I'm going to go with no as my answer.
A whole other History Day research topic is looking at the songs that candidates use on the campaign trail, right? What songs do they choose? Are they associated with the artists? In more recent times, some artists have said no to certain candidates to using their music because they don't align with their political views. And how do candidates and campaigns make choices? And why do they choose or target certain music based on maybe where in the country they're campaigning or which demographic they're trying to reach?
All right. So Jesse says, I love the way you've mixed the discussion of music with other historical documents. Is this a good way to get a rounded out picture of a historical period or event?
I think as a teacher, you really want to mix it up, right? There's no magic combination, but if all your students look at primary sources that are written or only ones that are visual or only ones that are recorded, they're getting a little snippet. And I think too, to help students understand, sometimes use an example from today, right? So maybe use a newspaper article from today and a song from today and a photograph from today. And then look at those things set back. I know there was a comment in Q&A about the interview about, the price of butter going up and maybe we shouldn't hoard all the butter and, make sure our groceries. And I think we've all seen that, right? With toilet paper hoarding. I think there's some really interesting parallels. And I think students would get that and understand that in a way that students even 2 years ago would be like, why would you go hoard groceries? You can always go next week, right? And that idea of, holding on to things. And I think sometimes when you can layer in the personal stories, some of you know parents or great-grandparents or grandparents who lived through this time. I know my great-grandparents who lived through the Depression hoarded sugar through their deaths in the 1990s because they ran out of sugar and did not like sugar rationing, and they liked sugar in their coffee. And they kept 10 pounds on hand from then on out. So habits, our habits are affected by when and where we grow up.
Mm-hmm.
I would also just add real briefly that to echo Lynne's point about, sort of mixing it up with different sort of cultural forms to juxtapose with, with other things that might be in the textbook that might be more sort of, political, social history, economic history, etc. It can also be useful to just check in maybe with some of the other teachers who are teaching your students, right? Who are doing literature, who are doing music, if you've got music, if you've got even, sports history, find out what they're doing in PE. I've always tried to do that. It takes more work and more time, but sometimes if the schedules allow, it can be a great overlap.
Since Lynn brought up rationing, there were a lot of rationing posters and propaganda out there. And if you'll notice that started to take a turn again, and those old propaganda posters started to appear because rationing came back in with how much you were allotted to buy pretty recently. Additionally, we saw the return of victory gardens pretty recently as well. So those are great ways to make those connections, and you can find those with quick Google searches. But I also noticed that a lot of you in the chat were saying when you were deciding on the Great Depression question, you based it off of your personal stories that your grandparents had. So I think that's always something to keep in mind is students don't necessarily have those particular stories, but they do have stories from their own families that can help to make those connections as well. All right. Vicky asks, is the assumption that since the recordings are on the LOC that they are in public domain? Can they be downloaded for other educational uses? For example, I used the LOC marches at the Veterans Day video today and parents wanted copies of the video. Any concerns about being able to do this? The music was sourced at the LOC.
That's a great question, and I hate that this is my answer, but from everything I've learned is that it depends. As a general rule, when you go on the LOC website, if you can download it, that generally means it is in the public domain. If you can't download it, it means that either they're not sure or that it's not. Now, when you're using any kind of music, it's absolutely crucial to source it and cite it. And it's really important because sometimes our students forget about that, right? They have all their credits for their documentary and the music playing in the background just never appears in there. And it's so important that they do that. Now, when you're using for educational fair use, right? You're using music that you download and put it in your student documentary, that's totally fine and fair game. However, where it gets tricky and where I would encourage you to be really careful when you're talking about duplicating, distributing, passing out, when you're putting any kind of firewall, like if you're charging a ticket price or a download price, that's where you get yourself into trouble. But what I would say is if you're using it in your classroom, in your school, for school projects, History Day projects, we fall under the educational fair use. But then as soon as students start putting things publicly and sharing things in public ways, that's where it gets into trouble. So that's where I would encourage you to be really careful. As soon as you said duplicate, I would get nervous and check. But as a general rule too, prior to 1923 or so, you're usually pretty good. Afterwards, it gets a whole lot harder. So it depends what you pulled and where you pulled it from. Dr. Capozzola, how have you learned or worked with this, especially in the books that you've worked with that I know include a bunch of LOC sources?
I think Lynn sort of hit the nail on the head, right? That often the Library of Congress in the bibliographic record, right? And you have those URLs in the document pack, and you can even follow them. You know, if you follow the breadcrumb trail in the PowerPoints, you can, we can get you back to the record. And very often it will say, no copyright restrictions, or some, in the public domain, etc. And if you see something like that, then then you should definitely see that as yours, right? These are public, right? And when they reach that point in history, and they belong to all of us. And of course, others can be used as Lynn said, in fair use, right? In teaching with the students, broadly speaking, that you're teaching. And sometimes, a webinar full of teachers, it counts as the classroom, right? Sort of a school performance, that doesn't charge money, that doesn't, isn't restricted, and can count as precisely that kind of thing.
All right, next question. Is there a way to find out if Gorney and or Harburg were naturalized citizens and served in World War I for the United States?
There probably is a way to find out. I'm not going to make you watch me Google right now as we do it, but it's a good question. And I think in some ways what you've hit on in this Q&A is how much of the American musical tradition is made by people who were not born in the United States, right? And particularly, the music industries that developed in so-called Tin Pan Alley, right, in New York at the turn of the century, we're drawing from all kinds of traditions, including immigrant traditions. And so, someone like Irving Berlin, right, sort of other kind of, real great 20th century patriotic classics were written by people for whom the United States was an adopted homeland. So it wouldn't surprise me at all, but I'd have to do some serious Google and NARA and ancestry work to be sure.
That would be my thought. Go straight to Ancestry and the National Archives. They have the most extensive collections on where people were born. You might get lucky when typing them in. All right, Lynn, this one's for you from Mark. Has interpretive dance or a 10-minute long, mainly musical, ever been successful in the NHD category? It seems like the category is dominated by a couple of characters in costume talking to each other, and I wanted to know if any other performances had been successful.
I think the key that performance students need to remember is really that a historical performance has to convey a historical argument. Now, I think there's really interesting ways to bring dance and music into that. But I think why that is often unsuccessful is that the students focus on the dance and not the history. And that's why at a place like History Day, it doesn't tend to play very well. Because if you do, let's say, an interpretive dance about September 11th, you can have a beautiful dance piece. But from a judge's point of view, what's the argument you're making? What's the evidence you're providing? How are you analyzing that evidence and drawing a conclusion? If dance is part of that and helps to show that, it can be very effective. But if it's just a dance performance, it doesn't tend to do well. You're right, many of the ones that are successful do tend to fall into the monologue or the dialogue small group model. But I think what you would want to encourage a student who has interest to kind of go a little outside the box is to say, okay, what's your argument? What's your reasoning? What's your evidence? Are you clearly demonstrating that to me through whatever artistic license you're taking? And make sure it doesn't get lost. So what I would do is have them script out, rough out, maybe sketch out or do a read through to an outside audience. So just have them stand up and do the rough performance and then say, okay, what was their argument? What's their thesis here? What are they trying to prove? What historical evidence are they bringing in, right? What are they talking about, singing about? How do their costumes or props play into it? But I think, like any good NHD performance, don't let the conventions take over the performance, right? If I watch you for 10 minutes and all I can think about is the costume you're wearing, I've probably missed the point of your performance, right? Or if all I can think about is the dance, wow, that's a beautiful ballerina. But if I don't know what the point is, now if you're using ballet to show the advancement of dance and using new techniques or strategies in choreography, and you're talking and then showing, now I'm more interested. So I think you have to really think, does it fit your topic? Is it effective? And when it comes down to it, whatever thing you want to do, does it drive forward your argument? Or is it just entertaining? Because if it's just entertaining, it's probably not going to go so well. But at the same time, as a teacher, I'm okay with performances that are a little different. I had a student do something that was just very avant-garde, where she looked at Langston Hughes and Arthur Miller and comparing and contrasting them to each other. It was a very different outside of the box performance. It did really well at regionals. It really didn't do well at states. But you know what? That student was really into the topic and really into the ways she was telling the story because she was using different techniques from her theater class. So in my mind as a teacher, that was a really successful performance, even though it didn't get near the finals, because that student really learned a lot and applied what she was learning with her theater and her history and her literature together.
All right. Last one from Anne. If we have a specific question that might help a student with a project and we need a contact person for a topic, can we send you an email, Lynn, or is there someone better to contact?
Oh, that's a question. Now, here's the key. What I would really encourage students, rather than, if there's a specific question about a rule, contact us. If there's a specific question about a technique, but when you get into specific content questions, that's where I'm going to send those students to the library. So I've gotten emails like, hey, will you be an expert for me on Helen Keller? And I have to be honest, I don't really know too much about Helen Keller outside of what's in the Wikipedia article, right? I'm not an expert. You don't want to talk to me. What you want to do is find the books and find the articles. Ashley and I at the NHD office are in a really tough spot because sometimes we'll get asked by teachers like, hey, my student's performance is going to States. Will you watch the video of it and give us feedback? And we are not allowed to do that. As hard as that can be for me sometimes, I'm like, I really want to help the student. We can't. And we can't because of the integrity of the contest, and we also can't because that's what we do all day. But this is where I encourage teachers to network with each other. So for example, I can't give you feedback on your student's website, but other teachers from other states and other areas absolutely can, right? And so that's where when they're looking content, and I would also encourage students, if they're getting stuck on content, I'm going to send them to their librarians, right? Either at their school or their local public librarians, because they're going to be able to do so much more to help the student than I ever could. And again, we do a lot of history here, but we do little bits and pieces, and Ashley has her specialty areas and I have my specialty areas, and they don't really overlap, but there's so many topics that come across, and that's the cool thing about History Day, that you learn about that you didn't know anything about ahead of time. All right, anything else in the queue, Ashley?
Nope, I think we're good.
All right.
I wanted to ask Lynn and Ashley if you think the Great Depression is depressing.
Ooh, he's putting us on the spot.
Honestly, I think it's all a matter of your perspective, right? If you were part of the Roosevelt family in Hyde Park, New York, the sense I get from the reading I've done is your life didn't change that much. However, if you were a family facing the massive unemployment in the cities, if you were farmers dealing with the Dust Bowl, it all depends on who you were. I do think it was a hard time for America, and we tried a lot of things. I think our country fundamentally changes because of the decade in so many different ways, with everything from temperance to the military to women's roles to agriculture. But I think it all depends on your perspective. And I think it's easy for us to see it in a more positive light because we're not in the middle of it, right? We always kind of are a little more morose about the challenges that we face right now because they're immediate, right? If you're facing not having a paycheck or not being, worrying about putting food on the table, that's 100% of your focus. So I think it depends on perspective. We kind of have a running joke about hashtag perspective, that kind of answers almost every question in history. But that would be what I would say. Ashley, what would you say?
I tend to veer more towards the depressing side of the Great Depression, only because it's very hard to get some of those breadline images and kind of Dust Bowl images, but even some of the letters that a lot of people in the Midwest wrote to both FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, just basically saying, I need basic things like coats and shoes. And just the plight of Americans, especially for farmers in the Midwest who experienced a depression well before the rest of the United States hit that, it's kind of hard to look at that and not think that's depressing. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't moments in the middle of the Great Depression where you can't find those happy moments, but I do tend to veer a little more towards that. This is a depressing moment, but I also think it shows the adversity of people and how they push through it. And you do see a lot of really good moments in that as people figure out what's going to work and how to succeed anyway.
Yeah. No, resilience for sure.
Yes.
For sure. And thank you for flagging those letters too. Many of them written by children, right? And there's some good collections, both in print books and online, that are really, really great to teach.
If you haven't seen those letters, track them down. You can find them with a Google search, but they are a great read. didn't always get a response from the president or the first lady, but they felt that they were both very average people they could write to and tell their lives to. So it's a great source to use.
And if you're working with younger learners too, the idea of bringing children into history. We don't have a lot of records of children in history really until the late 1800s and into the 1900s. But being able to see it through the eyes of another 12-year-old writing, "Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, can you send me a pair of your boys' shoes? I figure they're a little older than me." Like that's really gut-wrenching, but that really drives home to a lot of our students. And many of our students who still often deal with many of these same circumstances, they can identify with history. And once you can identify and see yourself in the history, it's a whole different game. All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap at that point. I'm going to say a huge thank you to Chris Capozzola from MIT, and thank you to the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium for providing the opportunity for this course. Please make sure before you log out, jot this down, tinyurl.com/nhd-isr21. If you bookmarked it from before, it's the same link. And if you run into any troubles, because this is a redirect, just shoot me an email and we'll get it off to you. So we're going to go ahead and wrap our recording. If you missed part of it or came in late, we will post the video first thing tomorrow morning once it processes. So thanks everybody and have a wonderful evening.